Hi, welcome. Welcome everyone in the room and everyone, the thousands that I'm sure are watching on the web. Makes me a little more nervous, but that's okay. So I'm going to talk today about some ongoing research, which is actually funded by the Federal Department of Transportation through a grant that's held at Western Washington University at the Border Policy Research Institute. So thanks to them for funding the research. And I've been working on this jointly with one of my students, Susan Albrecht, who couldn't make it today. But we're looking at the impact of variability in border crossing times on regional supply chains. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what that means. Well, the reason we're doing this work is because congestion at the border is perceived as a really big problem. To basically everyone involved in cross-border trade, shippers, the agencies that operate at the border, the DOTs, the Ministry of Transportation up in Canada. And there's certainly motivation to reduce both the average crossing time, but also the variability in crossing times. Good estimates of crossing time are necessary to run efficient logistical operations. So if you're trying to estimate how long it's going to take to cross the border, you need to know sort of how long does it take and how much does that vary by day or by week or by season. Delay and the variability in delay costs shippers and therefore consumers. So any trade that is supported by cross-border trade is impacted by these delays. The border crossings in the Cascade Gateway, and that's what we call the border crossings between Whatcom County in Washington State and lower mainland of BC, include the fourth busiest commercial crossing on the northern border. So it's actually at Pacific Highway, is one of the most significant truck crossings in the Canadian-U.S. border. And there's sort of an emphasis currently in transportation to try to measure transportation performance with data, and actually to use data to try to make better decisions. There has been quite a lot of emphasis on passenger transportation, but not so much on freight. And we would like to answer some questions like, how important is it to invest more in cross-border infrastructure? What can we do to actually reduce variability if we can't actually reduce just the average? So by variability, I think everybody knows what I mean, so the average delay might be what you would expect over time, but variability on a daily basis, right, the actual crossing time of the border might be an hour, it might be 2 hours, and on other days it's 10 minutes. So that variability is very hard to plan for from a logistics perspective. If they knew that every day it was an hour, that would actually be a lot easier than if they knew maybe the maximum was an hour and the minimum was 10 minutes. So our goal with this research was to guide decisions and investments for essentially operational changes that might be able to happen at the border that would have a positive impact on freight transportation. There's a lot of things you could do. You could, if you wanted to increase capacity, you could build some more gates that actually at the border and staff them with Border Patrol agents, and you could therefore increase capacity. That's a very expensive thing to do. You could have different staffing schemes so that the peak times usually extend longer than an 8-hour day, so it's difficult to staff agents such that you cover the entire day, and you have, say 4 border agents when it's very busy, and you need to keep them on all day because of the way we staff, typically by 8 hours, and the border agents are unionized. We also wanted to develop metrics that serve the industry. So we talk about variability, and that's not always easy for someone to understand in terms of what it means to their logistics operations. So you could look at the standard deviation, you could look at the 90th percentile, you could look at the average. And we wanted to come up with some metrics that actually worked for people in the industry and talk to them about how we could convey that information so that they found it useful. We wanted to understand the variability just better. What is the average? What is the standard deviation? What does the distribution look like? And how can we, what assumptions can we make based on that? And also we wanted to engage the shipping community. So with freight transportation, there's often, one of the difficulties doing sort of academic research in freight is that there's a big culture gap between academia and industry. And so sometimes we don't communicate particularly well together, and that was something we really wanted to learn more about and do better than we had historically. So today I'm going to briefly talk about the border crossings that we looked at, what's the state of them today? What is congestion like? What is the variability? And that data we have from some probe vehicles for the last 15 months. We wanted to look at responses to variability, so we've gone out and we've done interviews with shippers, carriers, and retailers as well about how this variability affects their logistics planning. And I'll show you a few examples. It's really hard to summarize the responses because it depends. There's a lot of different characteristics of these companies. And so I'm going to talk about 4 examples that I think are representative of at least the people we've talked to so far. And this is fairly qualitative. It's very. If we try to do interviews with a population that allowed us to say something statistically significant, I think we would have to spend a year or so doing interviews. So it's ongoing, and we're still developing our interview plan. But right now, these are fairly qualitative results. And then I'm going to make some summary comments that have been very consistent. So there are consistent messages. And some recommendations for borders. So what we're talking about is Whatcom County in the U.S. and Lower Mainland BC. I'll zoom in on that picture in a minute. But there are 4 ports of entry, and these statistics are just sort of to convey to you how significant these border crossings are. $43 million in trade every day goes across these 4 border crossings. 500,000 trucks in 2005. That's both northbound and southbound. Actually, the number of trucks northbound has been fairly flat for the last decade, which I found interesting. It was increasing steadily up till 2001, and then there was a distinct drop-off, and it's been increasing again since then. So actually, the numbers match about where we were 10 years ago. Obviously, 2001 was the terrorist attacks on September 11th, and that had a big impact on cross-border trade and security regulations at the border and how easy it was to move goods across the border. The number of truck crossings are very seasonal and peak in the late summer. And that is because of what's the major shopping season of the year? Halloween. Christmas, right? So actually the late summer is when most of those goods are actually moving to prepare for the Christmas shopping season. So there's a lot more happening in the late summer. It's also when people are going on vacation in this area, so it makes it difficult both with passengers and with freight transportation. A significant percentage of the trucks are actually empty, which is another interesting thing. I didn't know it would be that big. And the border serves many purposes. It's currently has a major security role, but there's also the FDA has a big role in terms of what can come into the country and inspecting agricultural goods. There's also some revenue and taxation services that happen at the border. So this is a little closer, but it's not great. So here are the 4 border crossings that we're talking about. The data I'm going to talk about today is from Pack Highway, which from a freight perspective is really the main crossing in this region. So this is a picture of the border as it is today. Oh, and I forgot to mention the slide in my introduction. This is the border crossing at Blaine in 1915. This is the sole border guard and his grandson. I thought that was kind of a neat picture. So there you are. What's that? 90 years ago, and here we are, 2005. Looks pretty different. So this is northbound, and then this is the southbound. So southbound is coming into the U.S. So this is the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Facility here. These are for passengers, and these are for trucks. You can see there's actually not very many lanes for trucks. There's actually from the infrastructure, there's only 3 lanes for trucks. And then these trucks over up there are going into Canada. And this is, you can see there's congestion. There's a lineup of trucks that goes out of the picture. That's fairly typical. So that's at Blaine, Washington, the Pacific Highway truck crossing. We focused on this one because it's got the most of the traffic. This is just some stats about it. I think I've covered this. Main one, it's primarily trucks. Passengers are sort of supposed to use Peace Arch, which is very close by. There's only 2 or 3 gates for trucks, typically. And it's really just 2 or 3. So there's actually not a lot of you can do to accommodate more traffic right now. You can have 3 lanes open or you can have 2 lanes open. And that is how it's staffed currently, 2 or 3 border officials. There is a fast lane at the border now, which is supposed to be a lane that gives priority service to people who have been sort of security cleared and comply with certain regulations at the border. It's supposed to be between 6 in the morning and 10 o'clock at night dedicated to people who are fast approved. You have to have fast approved drivers, fast approved trucks. It's very hard to do if you're a less than truckload carrier because everybody whose goods you're carrying have to be fast approved. So it's typically just truckload carriers, people who are crossing the border frequently. They've invested in getting this approval because it should make their wait times lower, and it does. But it's still the minority of traffic that crosses the border is fast approved. And actually, when the border is very congested and when wait times are about 3 hours, they open the fast lane to all traffic, which is not good from an operational perspective because just when it's really an advantage to use the fast lane, you lose that advantage. It's like when the freeway is really congested, they open the carpool lane to everybody. Well, that's exactly when you feel really good about having 2 people in your car and you get to go faster than the rest of the traffic. So they're not really incentivizing people, to use a consultee's word, to use the fast lane. And adoption has not been perhaps as quick as it could be. And I would say that's probably one of the reasons why. So the commodities moving across Pack Highway are primarily wood, pulp, paper products. We grow a lot of trees in BC and Washington, food and farm products, metals, petroleum, and a significant portion of them are empty trucks or empty containers. This is pretty different from the biggest commercial crossing between the USA and Canada. That's in Michigan, the Detroit area, where there are a lot of automobile manufacturing plants on both sides of the border, and they operate in a very tight time frame because most of those factories are operating just in time and they rely on deliveries to the minute of supplies for those factories. Typically, these goods are not operating in that kind of environment. Wood, pulp, and paper products, from what we've aren't particularly perishable. It's okay if they sit around for another week. The price doesn't change a whole lot, and the good doesn't decay in terms of value. There are some fresh products like seafood that we do a lot of trade between California and BC, and that is more time critical, but its deliveries are not timed to the minute. So it's not a highly time sensitive environment. The border, recent developments, since 2001 there has been a new building and a new traffic flow pattern at the border, but it did not actually provide additional infrastructure outside the addition of the fast lane. Most regular carriers are fast, but as I said, LTL or less than truckload carriers are not. So that's a truck that has deliveries for many destinations, not a truck full of stuff just for, say, Home Depot. And so when you look at the entire population, it's still a minority of carriers that are fast approved. I mentioned this. The fast lane is often used for general purpose. And I've tried to inquire about how often that happens, and there is no data. They don't officially keep track of that. So it's hard to say how often that occurs, but the border, the Jay Brandt, who manages the border from the southbound side at Pack Highway, suggests that that's less than once a month. So it's not particularly common. It happens more in the summer. Increasing the number of booths, so the queues at the border really just depend on how many trucks, what the truck arrival rate is, and how many people are serving the border. There's variation on the speed of service, but you basically are constrained by the number of booths. And that is very hard to change because you have to actually build new infrastructure. It could happen, but it's an infrastructure investment. Or you could change perhaps the way you staff the border, and that is governed by a contract between the union and the government agency that runs it. So they're not easy things to change. Border congestion is perceived as a really big problem, and I say perceived. Truck crossings have been increasing fairly rapidly, but as I said, the infrastructure hasn't. It costs cross-border businesses money. So if they have to wait longer, then their trip time is longer. And say you're moving freight, you charge more money for that. That's eventually passed off onto the consumer. So there's certainly a dampening effect on the economy from congestion at the border. There are many estimates as to what this costs businesses. One from the International Mobility and Trade Corridor Coalition, which is a function of the Whatcom County of Governments, estimate $22 million a year at Pack Highway alone. That would be the cost of congestion. Most of these estimates, though, are just based on the sort of what it costs to operate a truck. So what's the cost of a driver? What's the cost of fuel? What's the depreciation of that vehicle over the time? And they don't take into account what I'm trying to look at, and that is the less direct impact of congestion or variability or delay on the regional supply chain. So does that mean, so if the variability got very big, perhaps a company would not be able to move as much, right? If their utilization of their equipment is lower, they can't move as much stuff. They, in the longer term, they could buy more trucks. That costs money. So there's also some less direct impacts then, and these estimates of the value of the delay are really pretty straightforward. Doing a more thorough cost estimate is very difficult, as I will explain. So most agency systems must be accessed for each vehicle. So there's a FDA sort of interface, there's a Customs and Border Protection interface. So the actual processing time is quite slow. And they have computer screens, and they have to toggle between 5 different screens for every person that crosses the border. So there's been some emphasis on improving that, and they tried about a year ago, and it was a total disaster. So they're now have a new system called ACE, and they are requiring that everybody who crosses the border file an e-manifest, and that's going into effect on January 25th. So that's going to make a big change at the border. Right now, there's a lot of delay due to paper documentation needing to change hands, and if it's not right, then there's a conversation that has to happen between the border agent and the driver, and it's very time-consuming. There's great hope that these e-manifests have to be filed 24 hours in advance of your arrival at the border. Hopefully, that's all. There are systems that can check whether or not it's filled in correctly. Problems can be. We can be made aware of problems before the truck gets to the border, and hopefully it will speed up processing times. And some people you can do it voluntarily now, and there is some evidence that it has decreased border crossing times. So there's some hope with e-manifests, but it's a very big change. Mm-hmm.
They managed to link the e-manifest to the actual driver, and so all his records come up as well?
Yes, and so it's sort of old-fashioned manifests had something like 20 data entries, and the e-manifests have 100. There's a lot more information in the e-manifest, and they do have to, there's identifiers for the driver, the chassis, the container, if it's a container and chassis. There's unique identifiers for basically every piece of the thing, so the driver, the company that's from the origin, the destination of the goods, the equipment, so it's quite thorough.
Does that cause anybody problems having to identify the driver the 24 hours in advance?
Yeah, well, and in conjunction with the new security regulations on people providing transportation services, there certainly will be, I think there's a good portion of drivers that won't actually be able to be drivers anymore. That's more so true, I think, in drayage at ports. But some of the goods moving across the border here are drayed containers as well. So yeah, you could do a whole other talk on the sort of perfect storm in terms of availability of truck drivers and what's going to happen there. The FHWA has invested a fair bit of money in looking at freight performance measurement at border crossings, both the U.S. and Mexico border and the U.S. Canada border. But it's fairly high level. They have average crossing times, and that's sort of where it stops. They haven't tried to look at that data from an economic perspective. So we've looked at a huge literature because this topic relates to a lot of things. I've just listed a few here. Supply chain management and the sort of software systems that are used by logistics providers for retail companies. They keep track of all kinds of metrics like border wait time, and some of them have penalties for transportation providers who are late. So that's relevant. The value of time, as I mentioned, for goods movement, there's a significant literature there that we've looked at, but most of it is fairly superficial in terms of how they try to calculate the value of time. The elasticity of demand for goods movement is important because if we determine that there's some increased cost, then the amount that this impacts the economy depends on how elastic the demand is for that good. Say seafood, as it gets more expensive, fewer people will eat fish. There's been a heavy investment in ITS services at the border, and those are relevant, so we've had to look at those. We've looked at various data sets. But there hasn't been anyone who's really tried to look at specifically at the variability and the impact of variability on the logistics or supply chain. So what is the border crossing time right now? People talk about it, say it's very long, but what is the average? Well, we have data from fast approved vehicles. So this is going to be a lower bound to the wait times. There are vehicles that experience more delay, but with e-manifests, most vehicles will sort of be treated like fast vehicles. So we assume that it's perhaps a better thing to look at over the long term than non-fast approved vehicles. We have this probe vehicles that cross the border at 30-minute intervals every day of the week, every day of the year for the last 15 months. So we have a really nice sample of wait times. So there's almost 12,000 data points, so it's pretty thorough. The average wait time is different northbound and southbound. It's about 23 minutes coming into the U.S., and it's 17 minutes going into Canada. The averages are actually down since 2001. FAST has been implemented since then, and so have the e-manifests. So this is the average overall, northbound and southbound. And the standard deviation is not that big, so you could, 90% of the time your crossing time is going to be less than 47 minutes. So that struck me as not very long, right? 20 minutes is not that long to cross the border. You drive through downtown Seattle, I have to bet an extra hour, right? It might take me an extra hour at times to get from my house to the airport. So I didn't think that 20 minutes was really all that long. So what does the distribution look like? You might have been able to guess this. There's a lower bound that's zero, right? You can't have wait times less than zero. The average is about 20 minutes. But there are days when the wait time is much longer. Something happens, a truck breaks down in one of the lanes. They can't, for some reason, they don't have enough staff at the border. There's a problem with one of the vehicles, and they take a long time to get processed. So it's a skewed distribution, log normal distribution, and the wait times extend to about 4 hours. So there are days when the waits are extremely long. As I mentioned, southbound crossings take longer than northbound. They're also more variable. So this is the standard deviation, northbound, southbound crossings, and there's this is wait time in number of minutes. So it's about 17 minutes northbound and 23 southbound. You can see here when we look at the 90th percentile, it looks more extreme because there's that tail in our distribution. So when we showed these metrics to the carriers, these were the two that they really identified as important to them. This one is kind of nice because you can say, well, 10 out of 100 days it's going to take you more than 40 minutes. And you can say, well, once a month, right? If you're crossing 10 times a month, you could say once a month it's going to take you longer than an hour. But the rest of the time it's not. So originally I really thought we could come up with some really unique metrics that were going to represent the variability. We spent a lot of time looking at the data and calculating various metrics. And then we went to the shippers, and this is what they wanted to see, standard deviation and 90th percentile, which are pretty straightforward. So it wasn't for lack of trying to come up with something more creative. So this is variability by month of the year. So we and at this point we didn't have data for January, but this is February, March, April, May. So you can see for southbound, the variability is a little bit higher late in the summer. Not hugely different, but it's a little bit higher. And the red bars are coming into the U.S., the blue bars are going into Canada. The way the Canadian border operates, it's actually a lot more responsive to demand than the U.S. border is. So typically the U.S. border, 2 or 3 gates are open southbound, and that happens for 8-hour shifts. They can't respond to the demand by adding another agent because of the way that their contract is written. So unfortunately, coming into the U.S., we don't really, when we look outside and see that the queues are long, it's actually hard for them to change their staffing arrangement to deal with that. But that's not true going into Canada. They're actually much more demand responsive, and so you'll see that their variability is a little more constant. Also, when you go from 2 gates to 3 gates southbound, you increase capacity by 50%. So if there was a big queue, you have an immediate and fairly significant impact on the service rate, right? If you could do 100 trucks an hour at 2 gates, now you can do 150. So it's quite different. So there's big jumps in the service rate, and so the delay in a given day can jump around a lot. So it makes the data pretty jumpy, because on a given day, we have about 50 observations. So the Canadians, it's a very different job. The Canadians, it's not a military job. The Canadian border agents don't have weapons. There was a story last summer about someone who was being pursued by the police because he was a suspect in a murder, and he got to the Canadian border and he had a weapon out, and the Canadians just shut the border and left because they're not prepared to deal with an armed, I don't know what the right word is, an armed person. So it's quite a different job, and in the summer they hire university students to staff the border. So they have increased staffing in the summer, but it's a different role that they play. And if you go across the border, we went up to Vancouver recently, and we were waiting in line to go into Canada, and the sort of Canadian official has on street clothes with a red pinny over the top, and he's sort of directing traffic. And there's an American official who looks very military, and has a weapon and body armor on, and it's just sort of a different organization, and it's run very differently. So it affects this in that the Canadian officials can better deal with the variability because they can be a bit more demand responsive. So you'll see what I wanted to show here. This is hours in the day. So there is, in the middle of the night, there's still people crossing. There's some variability, but most of the variability goes up with demand during the day, which you probably would expect. As more trucks come to cross the border, delays go up, and so does the variability. So how does this affect supply chains? Well, supply chains are increasingly efficient. It's basically, to be competitive, it's sort of a requirement that you have fairly tight control over your supply chain. Now, companies like Dell, Walmart, that's how they've been successful. They've really tightened up control of their supply chain. The relevant parties are shippers. So if you make something and you want it to be delivered to somebody else, you might be an independent manufacturer and somebody else is your retailer, or you might be a multinational corporation who is in control both of the manufacturing and then also the consumption. Some of these companies have their own fleet. Some of them don't. Some of them hire third-party logistics carriers to actually do their transportation for them. Some of them hire trucking firms to do transportation. Some of them do that themselves. So carriers are actually the people who are moving the goods across the border. So third-party logistics providers. There's companies like FedEx and UPS also do this. Less than truckload, so trucks that have many deliveries in them. And this is harder logistically because you have to manage deliveries to many locations and pickups from probably many locations and probably some distribution center in the middle. Then there's short-haul and long-haul trucking, which are quite different. Long-haul truckers, there's a larger profit margin to be made in long-haul trucking. It's quite a sophisticated business. There's online auctions for truck capacity, and short-haul tends to be less so, more family-run businesses. It also matters to people actually selling goods, because if you're Kmart and you're selling plastic tubs and the transportation cost is bigger, you have to somehow cover that through the cost of the sale. Also wholesalers, who are just sort of another step before the retailer. And then ultimately it matters to consumers, because it will increase, presumably, more variability increases the cost of the goods. So we had some ideas about how this variability would impact the supply chain. Our first was increased buffer time. So if you're planning a delivery between Seattle and Vancouver, you say, well, the drive time is about 2.5 hours. It's going to take me, I'm going to estimate it's going to take me 60 minutes to cross the border. So as the variability gets bigger, you have to increase that buffer time. It's like if you're trying to go to the airport and you can't be late. You have to account for the longest transit time you think there is. And sometimes it takes less than that, and that's wasted time. Because you might have to build in 90 minutes, and it only takes 30, so now you have an hour that you can't really utilize your equipment. So this increased buffer times reduces the capacity of the existing infrastructure. So if you have 10 trucks and the trip used to take 5 hours, now it takes 6 hours, you can't do as many deliveries as you used to with the same infrastructure. Or you can, but you have to hire more drivers, say, and use the trucks more hours in a day. Both of those things increase cost. And also inventory cost, because the goods are sitting in the truck longer, so there's a cost to holding those goods. Your money is invested in those goods and not in other things. But increasing the buffer time reduces the chance that you're going to be late, and the chance that at the retail store they will run out of the goods that they want to sell. So if you don't have goods that you want to sell, that's a bummer, because you missed an opportunity to sell something. So increased buffer times was one of the ways. And the consequence of that would be increased transportation costs and inventory costs. Another thing you could do was increase your stock at the destination. Say that here we're assuming the origin and the destination are on other sides of the border. So if you increase safety stocks, then there's more held at the destination. So if it takes longer for a truck to get there, you can still accommodate the demand. So this really increases inventory cost, but it reduces the chance that you're going to miss a sale. This is most relevant if the transportation provider also holds the inventory, which is atypical. Most transportation providers just do what they're told in terms of how much they deliver and when they need to deliver it. They don't manage those decisions themselves. Then you could also change your logistic structure. Maybe move the location of your distribution center from one side of the border to the other, depending. And so the impact of this would be varied. And I'll talk about one case where this might help them. But it can reduce the impact of variability on your operations. And I'll show you an example of that. So one of our thoughts was, well, if you're driving, so we talked to a seafood company. Well, they're not a seafood company. They're a trucking company, and they move fresh seafood between BC and California. And they want to deliver to the wholesaler in LA no longer than 24 hours after the fish has come out of the ocean. So that's pretty hard to do. It's about 20 hours of driving between, say, BC and LA. But they have to drive through Seattle. They have to drive past Portland. They have to drive through the Bay Area, and they have to get to LA. So how much is 20 minutes? The 90th percentile is 40 minutes. So the difference between the average and the 90th percentile is 20 minutes. How much is 20 minutes of extra delay at the border really going to matter? Right? If your trip time, you're going to hit a lot more variability based on congestion than you are from the border crossing. But so congestion is another way that these companies have a hard time predicting what the travel time is going to be. And depending on what your trip is, it could be a lot more significant than the border. Border delays are due to various reasons. Documentation could just not be in check. There might be congestion at the border, might be called in for an extra FDA inspection. That's a big problem with fresh seafood. If they get sort of snagged for a random check by the FDA, that can cost them 4 or 5 hours at the border, and they have to hold goods at the border until they're finished. There are lots of other reasons. You might have a breakdown on the way there. Your driver might not show up. This is an issue. Driver availability is very constrained right now. And there might be a delay. Say if you're picking goods up from a processing plant and they're delayed, well, then you're delayed in doing your delivery. So we also wanted to put the delay in context. It seemed to me that delay from the border in many cases is not the largest source of delay. So I'm going to talk about these 4 examples because I think they're representative of many of the issues. So first one is a company that moves jet fuel between a refinery at Cherry Point and the Vancouver International Airport. They would like to have a constant stream of deliveries to the airport. They have a reservoir for fuel, and they would like to sort of have a constant input. It takes them half an hour to fill up a truck at Cherry Point. So they fill up a truck, they drive across the border, and they go to Vancouver International Airport where the truck is emptied. So that's this black arrow, and then they drive back to Cherry Point empty. And in the past, these could do this 3 times in one day, in one driver shift. So they experience delay at the border, and it's hard for them because they would like to have a constant arrival rate at the Vancouver airport. They have a reservoir, and it's best for them if sort of things are constantly arriving. But the border makes it hard for them to do that, and this trip is not very far. So the border for them is really the major source of variability. So what happens to them is they're allowed, Cherry Point's run by BP, and they also hold they're the fuel supplier for Vancouver Airport. They can charge BP if their wait times are more than 30 minutes. So they have an extra charge if delay times are particularly long at the border. So the trucking company doesn't actually incur more cost if there's delay at the border. They do if it's between 0 and 30 minutes, but once it's 30 minutes, they're allowed to charge based on a negotiated rate for extra delay time at the border. So it doesn't actually hurt the trucking company if there's delay. But they used to do 3 turns a day. Sometimes now they can only do 2. And so in those cases, they have to, because of hours of service regulations on the truckers, they have to hire additional staff to finish the deliveries. That does cost some money, but they build that into their freight rates. Every year they negotiate the rate with the supplier, and they just look historically at what does it cost, how often do we have to do this, and they increase their rate. So they're basically passing all of the cost onto the next person in the supply chain. And it's frustrating, perhaps. People don't like delay. It's frustrating to sit at the border, but financially, it doesn't actually cost them any money because they can pass all their costs off onto other people. They believe they're a pretty specialized provider because there are fairly different regulations on trucks, both south and north of the border. They have a fleet that's legal in both places. Right now, there's a shortage of available trucks, and so when they order a new truck, it takes about 18 months for them to get a new one. So it would be hard for somebody to really jump into this business very quickly. So for them, it's a hassle, but it's actually not going to hurt their business, really. It's going to increase the cost of fuel to Vancouver Airport. So that was pretty interesting, because this guy is one of the people who's really engaged in trying to reduce delay at the border. So another one is this fresh seafood company that basically moves fresh seafood from BC down to California. So there's these farms and processing plants and distributors that they need to pick up seafood from. They put many deliveries in one truck, and they have many trucks who do pickup. They cross the border. They go to a handling facility in Mount Vernon where they move stuff from one truck to another truck, because typically the pickup might be a big portion of halibut. But these deliveries, they want halibut going to each destination. So they take the goods out of one truck and they put them into many other trucks here at their handling facility in northern Washington. Then they drive to California. They actually pick up produce to return back to Washington so that their trucks aren't empty on the way back. So for them, border delay is a much bigger deal, because if there is, so they have 5 hours between when they want things to arrive here. They want things to arrive here about 9 o'clock at night, and they want their trucks to leave by 2 in the morning, because it takes about 18, 20 hours to get down to California. They want to deliver very early in the morning to their wholesalers, like 4 in the morning, because then they deliver to restaurants that morning. So a border delay to them is very problematic, because if one of these incoming trucks is late, so they might have 10 trucks incoming, and it's quite likely that one of them will take a bit longer than 20 minutes. It delays all of their outbound trucks, because there might be some halibut from one of those trucks going into every outbound truck. And there might be other deliveries in this truck that have nothing to do with the halibut. So the guy at wholesaler A says, well, I don't really care that your halibut truck was late. I'm not getting any halibut. I don't want to be penalized by your operations. So the fact that they have to consolidate and then deconsolidate loads makes this border delay a lot more problematic for them. Also, they are charged for spoiled goods. So they carry the risk of the fish going bad. And if the fish goes bad and they can't give it to the wholesaler, then they have to cover the cost of that through their own operations. So it's a bigger deal for them, and their time frames are fairly tight. So a delay of 3 hours could really throw things off. But what they do about that is, again, they negotiate rates annually, and they look back at last year's costs. They estimate how often things got spoiled, and they increase their rates to account for these issues. In any one year, it might be difficult for them to carry the loss, but if a year was particularly bad. But generally, the effect is that you're going to increase the freight rate and the cost of seafood to restaurant consumers or grocery store consumers in LA. They also find, they do find there's some verbal harassment for their truck drivers if they arrive late, and threats that they would go with another supplier. So there's also that's unpleasant to deal with on a daily basis. And there's a threat of somebody else doing this service for them if somebody else undercuts them rate-wise. So there is a possibility that if they just keep increasing their rates, they'll actually lose this business altogether. So here it is more significant to their logistics, and it might be beneficial for them to move this handling facility north of the border. Then only individual trucks outbound would be delayed, rather than perhaps a larger number of their outbound trucks would be delayed. But they're a Washington company, and they're probably not going to do that. But maybe a Canadian company would be able to outcompete them because they had less of an effect from this border delays because it was at a different position in their supply chain. So this border delay maybe, in this case, favors Canadian trucking firms over U.S. firms. So another example is a small truckload firm. So it's a family-run business up in Bellingham. And they basically take truckloads of goods. Again, typically their main business is from BC down to California, but they do pick up loads to return. So recently they've been moving telephone poles, or what will be telephone poles, from BC. They cross the border and they drive them down to California. They go to some other destination, it can be as far away as Arizona, empty, and then they return to some destination. It's typically not, it can be in the U.S., on this route, or it could be through the border. So their logistics is pretty simple. It's one origin, one destination. And if there's delay at the border, it really just impacts their arrival time at the destination. And what they do is they have increased the buffer time so for estimating when they're going to arrive, they put an hour into every trip, and they base their costs on that hour. So actually, most of the time, they get there before they thought they would with respect to border delay. And they actually charge a little bit more. People don't argue about an hour of extra rate, whereas the delay is usually less than that. So they've actually aren't complaining. about border delay. But they do get a lot of pressure when goods are late. They're not penalized financially, but people aren't happy when things are late, and so that they feel like if that happens too often, then they'll lose their competitive edge. Finally, we talked to a lumber reload facility up in Sumas, which is right near the border. So historically, with softwood lumber, it has been cheaper, tariff-wise, to bring goods across the border on a truck, put them on the rail in the U.S., and then ship them to their destination for goods going from BC to destinations in the U.S. That will probably be less true now that they've agreed on new tariff structures. But this company has made their business based on the differences in the tariff structures. So they come from the wood processing plant, go across the border to this reload facility, then they either go out on truck or on train. 80%, I think it's 88% of their goods go out on rail. So basically they are a loading facility for the rail lines, but they're an independent company. And the interesting thing here is that they actually get charged by the rail company if they don't utilize all of the cars that they said they would. The rail company is very powerful, and they say, okay, we're going to fill up 10 cars a day with wood, and we will pay you, to move those 10 cars. So if they show up, and because of this delay or because of some delay at the processing plant, only 9 are filled, well, then the reload facility has to pay to keep that extra car. And so it's a real penalty to them for delay in the incoming goods. They could hold more inventory for these companies, and then that would happen less often, but then that's incurring a cost to the companies for inventory. So right now, again, what they do, so they do face a real penalty, a financial penalty for delays, but what they've done about that, again, is increase their costs to the companies that are using their reload facility. So again, they negotiate contracts on an annual basis. So in any one year, they could really suffer if there's very high variability, but over the long term, they pass that cost on to their customer. So what we've seen really is that there's been an increase in transportation costs, not in inventory holding. So there's longer the inventory is held longer in transit, but we're that's not such a big cost as sort of holding inventory at a warehouse. So transportation cost has increased. Typically, there's an increased buffer time or actual penalty to the transportation provider. The costs are passed on from the transportation provider to the next entity in the supply chain, and therefore eventually to the end consumer. But the transportation companies had more power than we anticipated to increase freight rates. There's a very interesting relationship between the transportation provider and the company that they're working for. Because it's very symbiotic. The transportation provider has to provide, is competing with other transportation providers, but without that transportation provider, the goods cannot move and so cannot be sold. So at the same time, their customers are really at the mercy of the transportation provider. If they're an hour late, they can get angry. They could introduce some penalty, but they still need somebody to move the goods for them. And if somebody has to cross the border, it's going to be hard for anybody to avoid that. The case that's not true is where if they move their distribution facility north of the border, they can reduce some of that delay. So there is actually some advantage to having distribution facilities before the main source of variability. Eventually, this will increase the cost of any good that crosses the border and reduce consumption based on the elasticity of demand for that good. With quite a significant portion of the goods coming across the border are food and food products, which are fairly elastic. Wood products are not typically, but they support mainly the new housing construction or new building construction. But food is a much more cost-sensitive product, so it does have a dampening effect there. But really, there's the other variabilities in the supply chain are often more significant than the border. 20 minutes, the standard deviation is 20 minutes. That's not a lot, and most of these supply chains include some fairly long trips. So as I mentioned, the trip from BC to California. But the perception is that congestion is not fixable, that there's really no point in getting angry about congestion because there's nothing anybody could do about it. But the shippers don't have a huge value for what's happening at the border. They really see it as just a hindrance to trade and not serving a function that they really benefit from. I think maybe that's less true now that there's more of an emphasis on security at the border. But still, all of the carriers that we talk to really don't have any value for the border, would like to see it removed if that was possible. So they see congestion there as just a cost to them, really not providing them with any benefit. And that's different from congestion, where they felt like that was something that really can't be fixed. It is much more expensive to try to fix congestion. We've been trying to fix congestion for a long time, and I don't think we're going to fix it anytime soon. So it's probably true that congestion is fairly unfixable. But there's this perception that you could probably do a lot to change the border. So I think that with the implementation of e-manifests, which should happen with all cross-border trade in the next 90 days, which is really amazing, there should be some reduction in the delay and the variability in delay. So there are things that we can do now from a policy perspective to reduce the delay that really don't cost. They don't cost that much money. And I think you'll see this sort of solutions being information technology across other aspects of the freight world, say congestion pricing, things like that. But one of my takeaways was that really delay at the border isn't so bad. And people talk about it like it is really bad, but that's partly because we're all in the transportation industry, and it's sort of somewhat self-serving to say there's all these problems in transportation. So, and perhaps if you did a cost-benefit analysis, there's more you could do with fairly small investments at the border to reduce delays than you could, say, with congestion. Building a new lane on the freeway obviously is very expensive and doesn't solve congestion problems for very long. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Holly Stout. I actually was wondering if you were thinking that the e-manifest forms would become available on the internet, and if there was maybe a link to verify that they were filled out correctly in advance so that people could expedite their journey across the border.
Yes. So they will be, they have to be filed 24 hours in advance of the arrival at the border. That can happen. There is a portal where you can actually sort of, you right now could, or an individual can go to the internet and click on sort of all the boxes and put in all the information and send that to Customs and Border Protection. Or you can have a software system, which is more typical, which will send them automatically as the information is completed. So it's not like an actual person clicking a button.
And did you say that was for not just trucks and commercial crossings, but also residential crossings or
no.
Travelers, private travelers?
No, it's just for commercial trucking right now. There's a system called, or a program called Nexus for passengers, which is like a pre-clearance program, but it's fairly intensive, and you have to have an interview with the Nexus program to actually get clearance. But once you have that, you can bypass lines at the border for people who, like, say, commute across the border. So that's the passenger program, but e-manifest is the freight program, and there is a lot more data, and so part of why we have to do it 24 hours in advance is that it is then checked for completeness and sort of accurate. You can't really check accuracy, but you could check that the inputs made sense, so that they can be pre-cleared and then cross the border fairly quickly when they get there. And if there is a problem, they can be notified of that before they get to the border, so they're not part of the queue at the border and then only realize there's a problem when they actually get to the gate.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, how do these values of variability and average wait time compare to other border crossings across?
That's a great question. They're pretty small. If you're looking, what I've looked at are the major commercial crossings. So there's a lot more variability and delay in sort of the Detroit and New York border crossings. But there are lots of border crossings in Montana and North Dakota, which you could cross at with a truck, and I presume do not have huge wait times. But of the main commercial crossings, this one is lower than others. Yeah?
You talked about the percentage of the trucks that are empty that are crossing the border. Are those taken into special consideration, determined separately from ones that do have stuff in them?
Yeah, I think that used to be more true, because it used to be that an empty kind of got waved through. But that's not so much true anymore. And process-wise, officially, I think that there's not a benefit. But they are less likely to get secondary screenings and less likely to have some sort of agricultural check. So because they're empty, there are fewer other random checks they might get subject to. But sort of in terms of processing time at the gate, they're actually not shorter. But if you looked at the average statistics, they would be shorter because there are fewer other checks that they would get called in for. And they do X-ray scanning, radiation screening. So a truck full of kitty litter has a higher, radiation signal than something that's empty. So that might make it more likely that they got a secondary check. So I think the statistics would say it was shorter, but that's not because of any policy.
Can you talk a little bit about security? After 9/11, I was living in Seattle, and somebody was stopped at the border that was ready to set up a bomb and destroy the Space Eagle, and got intercepted, so it works. But, how much of the delay is due to the security checking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that we've looked at is whether or not the Homeland Security alert level correlates with the amount of delay at the border. And for the data that we have, it does not. So the amount of time you spend interacting with a border agent is not longer in a more secure, when the alert level is higher. That's one thing that we can quantitatively look at, because the alert level should represent the sort of state of the security environment. But there have been additional processes introduced since 9/11. For example, the radiation screening every truck now goes through. So it takes longer to cross the border because the process is different. But they're sort of it's the radiation screening and the new regulations on drivers and on e-manifest. So it's process-oriented changes that will make the delay longer, not that there is, say, more questioning that happens by an agent.
And how does the variability in getting through the whole situation compare with the variability of actually doing the transaction when you get to an agent?
Yeah, so the crossing time, the average delay, so that number, that 22 minutes I showed you, is from when you arrive at the end of the queue at the border and you then till the time that you leave the gate. So that includes a few things: waiting for all the other trucks to clear in front of you, interacting with the agent, and then any secondary screening that you might be subject to, or driving through the radiation portal. The actual average time for the interaction with the border agent is only about 40 seconds, whereas the total wait time or crossing time is 22 minutes. So the interaction is very short compared with the total cost of crossing.
And so that interaction probably doesn't vary much at all.
Yeah, because the variability is seconds, which doesn't seem like a lot of time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if there was an unusual situation, they would intercept that driver and take them aside.
Right, then they have a secondary, right. Yeah. But I don't know things like how the country of origin of the driver affects crossing time, how the, how responses might affect the interview time. I don't know things like that.
We have a question from one of our students watching on the web, and she's asking if some of the issues that you identified and the results, do you think that they might be transferable to the southern border crossing with Mexico, or perhaps is security even a bigger influence down there? I mean, I don't know if anyone's done comparable work.
So we have statistics on like average crossing time at the Mexican border from the FHWA. They're not very detailed, so I don't know what is the actual interview time and what is queuing time. And you'd have to look at sort of the number of approach lanes, things like that. But the average crossing times are certainly bigger with the U.S.-Mexico borders. I think there is more scrutiny than at the Canadian border, but that's a very hard thing to measure, because the process is the same. But I would suspect the interview times are longer because of what I can see from the average wait times and the infrastructure. But it's hard to get very precise data on, because right now what we do is we have surveyors actually, clicking sort of where they are at each stage. I think I might have a picture of that processing. No. This is probably pretty hard to see, but so this is from a data collection effort so you have to measure where is the back of the queue, and that's constantly changing. So it's hard to have an automated process for identifying when somebody arrives at the back of the queue. So most of the data, so the data we have is self-reporting by the drivers, which is subject to some error, especially if they are compensated monetarily, for additional delay. So some of the data we have is from a survey where the surveyor actually stood here and ran back and forth and measured where the back of the queue was. But he really had to literally sprint at times to keep up with sort of where it was, because when they would open another gate, when they go from 2 to 3 and the capacity is increased by 50%, this queue dissipates very quickly. So very detailed data on the border crossing times it's hard to get from an automated system, and so typically data at that level is gathered by individuals, which is very expensive. So the time frame is short. Did you have a question?
I was wondering, you said that average time is 40 seconds for interaction. It seemed that then adding another gate, like a fourth gate, would do more to reduce the congestion than these e-manifests or those type of things.
Yeah, and that's an open question, because I'm not sure how much the e-manifest is going to make a difference. But right now there's actually only 3. This is before it was finished. No, there's actually only 3 truck gates in the building. So there's only infrastructure for 3 gates. So to add another one, you just have to build some more. Yeah, which doesn't cost so much money, but hasn't had the political will to have that happen so far. There are more gates on the Canadian side, but and at times they have 4 gates open.
I'm just wondering. The performance measures you use, standard deviation and 90th percentile, you mentioned you tried to get more. What are some examples of some of the other measures you would have liked to have used, I guess?
So like we compared the standard deviation to the average, because if the standard deviation is 20 minutes but the average is 2 hours, that's very different from if the standard deviation is 20 minutes and the average is 20 minutes. So we tried various combinations of bringing together the average and the standard deviation. We also tried a lot of graphics where we plotted the average and then we plotted the 90th percentile. So because we assumed that a graphic might be more useful for people, and we actually based that a lot on some of the work they've done in passenger travel and trying to give people graphics that represent sort of their commute times. So they include the average and then the distribution. But we didn't, people, I guess there was more familiarity with standard deviation than we had expected there would be.
Let me just throw out a couple more web questions.
Yeah.
Quickly, the e-manifest technology, is that also being used at the U.S.-Mexico border as well?
Yes.
So that's a whole U.S. thing. And then Do you have any idea of how much that alone might be saving in terms of crossing time?
Right. No, and that would be very interesting to know. We did get some data from manifests. So all the manifests are filed and held with Customs and Border Protection, and we've used them. They are willing to pull them. For the week that we collected this data, they actually pulled the manifest so that we could match license plates like with commodities. And we could see if there was a difference in processing time by commodity. But they don't indicate if they're, so far, that data doesn't include if it was electronically filed or not. So we don't have that data, and I haven't seen anybody who's been able to use it. But that would be very interesting because then you could try to predict what the impact of this requirement was going to be. Everyone anticipates that it will help. I'm sure in the short term it's not going to help. It's going to be, a learning curve, and for a while it's going to be harder. But in the long term, there's certainly an expectation that it will reduce delay, but nobody really knows how much it will be reduced, and I haven't seen any work where people are trying to estimate that.
And then there was one final question here dealing with sort of the truck versus rail, and would there be any reason why delays at the border would encourage a shift to rail, which led me to wonder, there is no rail crossing across the border, is there? Or is there?
Yeah.
So would it?
Yeah. People don't do a lot of, I think that when it comes down to that mode choice, there's a lot more that matters than the variability, like the value of the goods, the final destination, your contract with the existing rail line, or the availability of rail, how close that is to your facility. So I don't think, it's just my opinion, I wouldn't assume that variability played into it enough that would really be a driver of mode choice. But perhaps as it got bigger or it was harder to cross the border, it might become more of an issue. Yeah, right. Yeah. But it isn't great. The rail infrastructure, especially between BC and California, you have to change ownership, you change lines, so it's actually not very competitive with truck, which is why you see a lot of the stuff moving by truck between BC and California.
Any last questions?
So before we thank our speaker, I'd like to remind everybody that next week there is no seminar. It's Veterans Day. The Friday following on the 17th, quantifying walkability towards an objective and reliable measure of the pedestrian environment, Jamie Parks from Kittleson Associates. So with that, I'd like to thank Anne for coming down from UW to give this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for all your questions.